tonight, Sir David has come to talk about the future cities. Sir David, I hand the floor over to you.
When I was in government, I think the activity that I enjoyed the most and felt most proud of in terms of outcomes was the Foresight Program, which I developed into an in-depth process. And the Foresight Program, we ended up doing the projects indicated here over a 7.5-year period. It involved working with academics, business people, etc., from across the country, and occasionally from across the world. Experts were pulled out, not from within government, but from outside. Because one of the lessons I learned quite quickly was that as Chief Scientific Advisor, my role, the way I interpreted my role, was that I should be acting as a means of bringing cutting-edge information from the academic community into government for better decision-making. And so these were the projects that we chose, and the very first one I chose was on flood and coastal defences, which turns out more recently to have been quite appropriate. And in essence, so this one down here, it took 3 years. There were 120 experts, economists, climate scientists, engineers, working on the project. And we came up with a report which I was asked to present to the combined Houses of Parliament. And I think that report probably had more impact in terms of persuading the British government that we should act on climate change than anything else. In the recent floods, the proposals we put forward in that report were effectively tested out. And it's very difficult to describe this on television, so I'm much happier in front of an audience like this, although I'm aware of the camera on me. But in that report, 2004, we said, first of all, government needs to spend about £500 million a year on improving our flood defences, because the biggest challenge to the UK from climate change was rising sea levels and changing patterns of storms, both at sea and on land at the same time. And in addition to that, we put forward a fairly detailed report of action on water management. And so during these recent floods, what we actually saw was the diversion of flood waters into what we designated in 2004 as floodplains. Now, the reason this is connected with future cities is because effectively we diverted the floodwaters away from the cities and towns of Britain. So none of our major assets were flooded during that whole period. The worst floods on record, and not one of our cities or towns was flooded. Now, when I say that, I know that there are people in those floodplains who didn't have such a good time. So I'm fully aware of the cost of that, but believe me, the cost to the country of those floods would have been measured in hundreds of billions of pounds if that process hadn't been put in place, because that's what happens when a major city is flooded. This gave government a long-range view, and governments aren't always good at long-term decision-making. But what was important about this was every project was chaired by at least one minister. There were 30 ministers of government involved over that 7.5-year period in these projects. And quite a few of these projects are very relevant to what I'm talking about tonight. So we learned an awful lot about the relationship between energy and the built environment, the flooding of the built environment. Intelligent infrastructure systems was aimed mainly at transport. So all of these key sectors that we covered were heavily directed at the built environment, which is, of course, a very important part of what we're doing. Now, I want to leap ahead and say, make a very general statement. My thesis is that the 21st century is faced with a new set of challenges, a set of challenges we've never had to face up to, we being our civilization never had to face up to before. And what I'm suggesting is that all of our successes in the 20th century, and they were numerous, the rollout of science, engineering, medicine, technology into society produced a massive improvement in human well-being. And there's a simple measure of that, and that is life expectancy. So life expectancy in Britain and much of the Western world was around 40 in 1900, and by the end of the century, that had gone up to 80. Life expectancy is actually also key, a measure of survival of young children into maturity. And as young children survive into maturity, they form families who have more young children. And so a consequence of this rollout of human well-being across the world was necessarily a rise in the population. And you could say the rise in the population was, again, a measure of that success. So we started the last century at 1.5 billion people, and we ended the century at 6 billion. We started adding another billion every 12 years. As a consequence, I'm suggesting, of all the good rollout. Now, the good news is that this population growth, that sudden rapid expansion, is over. The average number of children per woman for the whole planet today is 2.2, which is an incredible number. People say to me, well, what about Bangladesh? Well, Bangladesh is 2.3. So what you've seen is a collapse in the number of children per woman. This is the rollout of female education, female empowerment, the availability of contraceptives. You will see I'm giving no credit to the men. But that's a serious point. Now, what this means is that the remaining population growth, this is the IASA projection, the remaining population growth is simply the under 15-year-old cohort, which is 2 billion today and will still be 2 billion in 15 years' time, that cohort growing through the system and eventually replacing a 1 billion cohort in my age group, the over 60s. Right? So that's the growth that's left. And that means we're planning for a world of 9 billion by mid-century. That's a very specific objective. But then underlying this is a secondary, and I think critically important demographic transformation, which is the rise in the middle class. Now, 1 billion out of the 6 billion in the year 2000 were middle class. I'm defining my term accurately. Those who spend between $10 and $100 a day, I'm describing as middle class. 2013, last year, we passed 2 billion. So we've already doubled that number. Here's well-being, again rolling out, and the economic projections, and we are using these projections to create this projection, created a demographic expectation of closing in on 5 billion out of 8 billion by 2030. This is this rapid rollout, which is essentially happening now in the Asia-Pacific region and is then going to spread across Africa. 8 of the fastest growing countries in the world today are in Africa. All right, so what we're seeing is a big rollout of middle-class consumers. I'm stressing that word consumers. It's us, middle-class people, who are the consumers of commodities. And that is the big new challenge. Because the planet was being pushed to its limits to provide consumable goods at the level of 1 billion, and the stresses on planet's resources at 2 billion are also way beyond capability of sustained continuation if we carry on as we did in the 20th century. So then the follow-through from this, and these are the numbers, this was written before we hit 2 billion, so we're now at 2.2 billion. It's happening very rapidly. 3 billion more middle-class consumers by 2030, and 90% of that in the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, what happens to middle-class people is that they leave the subsistence farming style of living and move into an urban environment. And so what we're now talking about is the world's fastest rising urban development that we've ever experienced. And that is happening today. And anyone who's been recently to Beijing would be simply amazed compared with just 20 years ago, or Shanghai. These are very glitzy cities, but very densely populated. So we're looking at a world that is rapidly changing. And of course, behind this is new powers emerging. So we've got a different power structure coming through the system as well. Now, just to stress the number of urban dwellers, 2008, more than 50% of the total population. 2050, it'll be more than 70%. Urban dwellers, that's the best estimate we have at the moment. And it's in 2050, remember, it's 70% of 9 billion, so that's over 6 billion. And here it's 50% of 7 billion, so that's 3.5 billion. So there's this big and very rapid growth in the urban middle class that we're seeing. So what I really want to get across is the message that this is happening now, and we don't have the luxury of planning into the future. Action is needed now if we're going to turn this rapid development into an opportunity rather than a rather disastrous risk. If we're not going to have cities that simply develop as slums creating problems into the future, if we are going to have cities that are optimally designed for these 21st century challenges, we have to move very quickly. And that's really what I'm dwelling on here. So 95% of the increasing urban population will be in developing countries and mainly in smaller cities. That's the Asia group, 3.3 billion, and Africa's group, 1.3 billion new urban developers in those regions. Big opportunity, but it's also a big a global urban challenge. 80% of the world's population already live in areas with a high threat of water security. And that number is rising all the time. When we think about this, I think we tend to think of the developing world. So let me just stress, Southern Australia is one of those areas under new water stress. About 14 years now of successive drought in the state of Victoria, which means that cities like Melbourne and the other towns in that region are already suffering water stress. Now, this is bringing through some good behavior. People are using water much more sparingly in those places under water stress. But at the same time, there's a tendency to switch over to fossil fuels to produce fresh water from ocean water. And of course, it's burning the fossil fuels that's causing climate change, that's causing the desertification. So you're actually making the problem worse that you're trying to tackle through the solution. If you ever visit the Middle East, you go to Dubai, you will be drinking desalinated water. And I'm afraid the bad news is that instead of the local price of oil being $120 a barrel, it's the biggest subsidy in the world. It's $5 a barrel locally, and so you burn oil to make fresh water, which ain't smart. So 60% of the world's ecosystems are already either degraded or used unsustainably. Why is that critically important to me? That's not a question of the population of wild animals. That is a question of our survivability. We depend on our ecosystems critically for our living conditions. The entire animal population. 95% of food production is highly dependent on oil. So we see the interrelationship between these challenges. You cannot produce food if you don't have lots of water. A kilogram of beef takes 12,000 to 14,000 liters of water to produce, and you can't produce the crops to feed the animals, etc. 11% of the world's remaining natural areas could be lost by 2050. So we see the challenges. Now, what Future Cities Catapult is all about, and I'm delighted that our first CEO, Peter Madden, is here, and he's a Bristol person, so he knows many of you. We want to see that we can focus on these three headline activities. Of course, the economy is important. Of course, quality of life is important, and of course, environment. But the point is that these three are totally interactive. We're not going to have one without the other as we move forward in time. So the focus on these three headlines as we look at urban development in the developing world and urban regeneration in the developed world is absolutely key to the work of Future Cities Catapult. In addition to the commodity challenge, and I'll say a bit more about that, of course we have climate change as well. And this is, I'm quite fond of this curve because it was produced by the Proudman Institute in Liverpool when there was criticism about the manipulation of data. There's no manipulation here. This is a gathering of data from the days of the British Empire. We measured everything in sight and we kept very good records of what we measured. And so all the Proudman Institute has done, an enormous piece of work, is go back to all the records from the British Empire to look at sea levels, because they were measured and the measurements were left there. And so this is sea level measurements of that period all the way up to the present day. The sea level, of course, is a very good indicator of global warming because it's a thermometer. As the liquid is heated, it expands, just as in a thermometer. So this is a very good measure of the temperature rise. And of course, needless to say, the rise is accelerating. So we're seeing it go from 2 millimeters a year to more like 3 millimeters a year over the last 10 years. So this is so far only a 25 centimeter rise. But with the most recent publication, just last week, we now know that a big chunk of the Antarctic is breaking away and moving into warm water and will melt. It's now estimated that by the end of this century, we are likely to see a sea level rise in the region of 1 meter. Now, most of our cities are based on coastlines. It's roughly 80% around the world. And so, of course, this rising sea level is a massive challenge to our urban development. So when we try to future-proof, and that's a phrase I'm going to use, when we try to future-proof our cities, we just need to bear this in mind. Now, of course, nobody wants to see a meter rise in sea level, so not only do we have to adapt, and that flood program for the UK was the very first adaptation program for any country. Not only do we have to put up defenses, but we have to reduce emissions. So another big demand from this sort of data is that we have to stop using fossil fuels and we have to stop deforestation. By the way, don't underestimate continued deforestation. Deforestation today is effectively causing as much carbon dioxide increase in the atmosphere as the whole of the developed world's use of fossil fuels. So it's both of these that we have to manage as we go forward in time. Here's the most important data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just to stress this point about stopping the use of fossil fuels and deforestation. And when I said beef, 12,000 liters of water, Mato Grosso in Brazil, that great state which produces beef for the world, they take out the forests as our demand goes up. You know, we mustn't forget our responsibility as well in this process. And Brazil has done very well at trying to protect the forests. They've reduced deforestation by 80% over the last 9 years. Okay, so what this curve says is that the This is, on the vertical axis, temperature rise so far. This is a critically important curve, and that's the increase in carbon dioxide due to human activity. And you'll see that this, if the black data points to here, are data points. This is the average for the planet so far, and it's a pretty good straight line. And as we go further up, these are then theoretical projections. So far, the theory, if I run the theory backwards, I get a pretty good agreement. And so we've got some faith in the theory. It's an understatement to say some faith. This has been reproduced so many times now that if we continue business as usual, we're likely to be at a 4.5 degree centigrade world. There's some error margin there, so it could be a much hotter world, and if we were lucky, it could be a cooler world. But I don't think any of us would say we should bank on luck. So the question then is, the United Nations has said we've got to stay below a 2 degree centigrade increase. There's 2 degrees. We've already got a 1 degree increase. That means that we've already burnt half the carbon dioxide and cut down half the forests that we can do if we want to stay at that point. So if we're going to manage this problem, let me put it to you this way. If we continue growing emissions globally at 2% per annum, we run out of our carbon budget in 2043. 2043. So if we get to 2043 and we've reached that point, the only way we would stay at 2 degrees centigrade is if we cut all emissions to zero within a year. That's not going to happen. We've got a negotiating process that I'm now full-time actively involved in, and this is why I'm talking perhaps at length about this subject. And what this means is that if we get a good agreement in Paris in December 2015, in 2020, when that agreement bites, we have to go from 2% up a year to 3.2% down to stay within our carbon budget. That's what it means. So it's a problem not for tomorrow. It's a problem with a very short timeline, and we have a large job on our hands to manage that. The UK is the world leader on policy, but we have countries like Mexico that have come in right behind us, aided by the British government. So we've got a whole range of countries coming in with this 80% commitment to reduce by 2050. We've got it written into an act of parliament. No government of the day can undo that without a 2/3 majority. So we just need to remember this pessimism that I hear. That's my job. It's to get over that pessimism. We're en route. The first 4 years, 2008 to 2012, we did a little better than we were proposed to do. We set up a climate change committee. We're reducing our emissions year on year as we go forward in time. And it's a commitment, as I say, with a parliamentary act behind it. This means that by 2050, we're going to have a grid which doesn't produce electricity with CO2 emissions. And it also means that the surface transport sector has to be switched onto the grid. So no more oil usage in surface transport. So those are our key objectives. And the Department of Energy and Climate Change was formed in order to deliver that. And that's Ed Davey, the Secretary of State, who has the task to demonstrate to Parliament that that is on stream. Now, one of the factors that helps this is that rising middle class creating so much demand on oil, for example, that oil prices have shot up very sharply. This is a plot we produced and published in Nature in 2012. So it's simply showing on the horizontal axis the amount of oil produced globally per annum. So here it is at about 64 million barrels a day when the price was $15 a barrel. Now, believe it or not, that was 1998. That's relatively recent, when the price was only, this is all in real terms, so that each price is comparable to today's prices. Production goes up to meet demand at 74, 75 million barrels a day, and the price has risen to $40 a barrel. And then suddenly, you'll see that as production went up to 75 at the most, oil prices went up to $120, $140 a barrel and oscillated around and have now stayed up there. That is precisely to do with this very large new consumer demand, double the consumer demand on the planet. And those consumers all want to live with big SUVs. They've seen it on the Hollywood movies. And yes, we all want to live like that, don't we? And at the same time, we are running out of crude oil. So what I'm actually plotting here, the key phrase is crude oil price versus crude oil production. The turning point is 2005. The global economic downturn, 2007. I don't believe these two factors are unrelated, let me put it that way. And what has happened is the crude oil production has stalled and can only go backwards. That's crude oil. Demand today is 92 million barrels a day, so demand is way off. So 2005, we could meet demand with crude oil. As demand kept rising, where's the oil coming from? It's coming from tar sands, and it's coming from 2 miles down in the Gulf of Mexico. It's coming from these sources which are essentially far more expensive than crude oil to produce, but they're also more expensive for our environment. If you take tar sands and convert it to oil, you've got a very heat-intensive process. So the footprint of the new oil out here, in terms of carbon dioxide production, is much higher than the crude oil. So why do I think that's good news? I think that's good news because any economist would tell you that high prices drive through alternative behaviors, much more energy efficiency being driven through by this, and of course the seeking after alternative means of transport. So there's an awful lot of research going on. Now, here's a simple piece of economics. We're looking at a basket of commodity prices. And the commodity prices here is a mix of food, energy, and minerals, key commodities to humanity. And you'll see this is the OPEC oil shock. But far bigger than the OPEC oil shock is what's happened since the 1990s. See, the commodity prices have increased 2.5-fold. And this is all three of those. I've just shown you what happened to oil, but food prices went up a factor of 3 in 2005, 2007, and mineral prices are still going up. Occasionally they come down, but they are essentially going upwards. Cheap minerals, as with crude oil, have already been mined. The big veins have been mined out. So as we move through this century, you can see that the form of behavior that means you mine minerals and you mine oil, you convert them into marketable goods such as plastics, and then you throw them away, that is no longer appropriate. So as we move through the century, we've got a new form of behavior which I will describe. Now, let me give you my thesis about the Arab Spring. And it's very much driven by these pictures of Tahrir Square in Cairo, taken in the early days of the Arab Spring. And the point I want to make is that these are very orderly rows of protesters. It's not like our protesters on the streets when something goes wrong here. These, I believe, are the middle classes that are just up and coming. Why are they complaining? This happened just after the big food price rise, that 3-fold increase in food prices. And so if you're an aspiring middle-class person and are expecting to live like my audience here, and you suddenly find you can afford nothing of the kind because prices are chasing up faster than your salary increase, then you get a bit unhappy. And so I do feel that what has rolled out into Syria today, which is disastrous, was all initiated by what I'm now talking about. So I think that out of this set of drivers, coming from demographics, and in particular this rapid rise in the middle class, we've suddenly got a correlated set of challenges. That is water stress, food stress. We've got oil and other energy forms, issues around security of energy supply, rapidly and suddenly sharpened when the Ukraine-Russia situation arises. We've become very sensitive to a given and finite set of resources. And what this impacts on, I'm suggesting, is conflict and terrorism. And as we produce more food, and I've just said that needs more water, it needs more oil because food has to be transported, we are also managing to remove our remaining ecosystems, which is a big part of what makes the planet survivable for us. And there's the nature of the challenge of the 21st century, in my view. We never had to worry about these things before, but suddenly we've got it all coming at us at once. You may be familiar with this. This is a plot of urban density as a function of, and in this case, it's private transport energy use. And the point I want to make with this plot, first of all, is, isn't it a bit strange? Wouldn't you have expected perhaps something like a linear plot? It's nothing like linear, it's hyperbolic. And that was certainly a surprise when it first appeared. This means that these very low density cities, Houston being the world record lowest density city, but these cities were developed at the time after the arrival of the car. And the medieval cities are down here, and then you've got cities like Hong Kong with a very finite space to occupy. But the key point I wanted to make was that the cities that were developed in the medieval period were developed for people to walk about. Not many people had carriages and horses, and so the ideal city was the European city, which was dense. It was mixed kinds of activities, shops, near urban dwelling centers, near parks, so you had a great mix within these rather dense medieval cities. And I'm suggesting that these are the cities that are fit for purpose in the 21st century. This is the accident of history, that the medieval cities have got about the right design. And it's these post-automobile cities that are in trouble when facing the challenges of the future. Just out of interest, you might have seen that I did a Foresight analysis of obesity as well. I led one. And out of interest, we plotted, instead of the usage of fuel, we plotted obesity levels, and it's a very similar plot. So if you live in Houston, I think it's fair to say you don't even walk outside the house. There's a room in the house for the car, and you drive out and you go and see your neighbor. So it's a very different, and I would suggest unhealthy lifestyle. So I'm going to reach a conclusion right away about the ideal city of the future. It's walkable and cyclable. It's good for human well-being, and let's focus on well-being right at the top, to have a walkable, cyclable city. And interestingly, because of this shape of the plot, the hyperbolic shape, you can actually say that these cities are pretty well optimal. It does get perhaps a bit uncomfortable living in a city like Hong Kong, but the added advantage compared with Tokyo, Singapore, and even London is not very great. So there's an optimal sweet spot for urban development, and that sweet spot is down here. I'm afraid I haven't got Bristol on there, but I'm sure it's in the sweet spot. If we look at pictures like this of London, and this could have been taken today, where people can walk out of their offices or out of their flats and houses into the numerous parks, London was designed for that sort of usage, where everything was available for walking. Now, just a few quick words about transportation. So again, this is from the Foresight analyses. If we look at fuel consumption along here and the carbon footprint of the fuel along there, what we want is to be in a low-carbon society. So we want low fuel consumption, and very little carbon content in the fuel itself. And so what we're seeing is a transition from petrol through biofuels, added hydrogen, electricity. As we move forward in time, everything in terms of urban mobility has to go onto that electricity grid. And that is what's already happening in Europe. It's not just happening, it's being encouraged by various measures taken by governments. In the British government's case, it's no congestion charge if you're driving an electric vehicle around London, very big advantage. No road tax if your car's less than 100 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre. These are driving us into asking for those vehicles, and that's driving the vehicle producers into producing these vehicles. So moving up this channel here, and then looking at engine efficiency, all of these activities, that's being delivered by the car manufacturers. Design includes mass, the fuel, the mass to energy ratio is an absolute crucial part of this process. Then we come to rail, and you'll see that from this that I'm a bit of a fan of high-speed rail, so we could have an argument about this. I'm just pointing out here the comparison in fuel usage in today's terms between an SUV to get you around, air travel, and high-speed rail. Right, so for me, the killer argument for high-speed rail is that we get many more passengers onto the rail. At the moment, our railway lines are effectively close to saturation. The high-speed rail system will have much longer platforms, much longer trains, and we'll be able to get many more passengers moving around by train. So that becomes a key part of this transition that we're involved in. High speed, yes, important, because we want to encourage people away from air as we move forward in time from air travel. There's a second factor, and of course, this is the sort of photograph that could be taken anywhere in the world, and that is congestion, and how much time each person sitting in those cars is spending each day. I can tell you what it is for Houston because that was a figure we produced. On average, 7 days a week, a Houston dweller spends 3 hours a day in the car. That's a big chunk of life sitting in a car. And most of it getting a bit upset and stressed because no other cars are moving. Why are all these other drivers on the road? And here's a picture. I've indicated there this is Bogota, but I spoke in Calcutta recently, and I took that word Bogota off the slide, and I asked my audience to guess where these photographs were taken, and they all thought this was somewhere in India, and this was somewhere in the developed world. Now, it's the same city, same vantage point, camera set up in the same building, and it's taken on the same time of the day, same day of the week. The difference is 3 years in time. The mayor was elected on a ticket to give the city back to the people. And what he said was quite simple. There were 5-lane highways coming into the city from the outskirts, and for every 5-lane highway, he said, decree. The outer lane is for pedestrians only. The second lane is for cyclists only. The third lane for buses that make many stops through the city. And the fourth lane for buses that make a few stops through the city. And the fifth lane if you still want to bring your car into the city. So the number of cars automatically reduced, but interestingly, the pedestrians took over the city. You'll see that with this vertical parking, pedestrians were forced to dance into the street between driving cars. But more than that, and this is something that was of course not planned for, have a look at the sky in these pictures, and you'll see that the people of Bogota had actually forgotten that their city was surrounded by mountains. So suddenly the atmosphere has dramatically improved. So the benefits were so clear, and people are still able to get into the city, still able to work, and they're talking to each other in these buses. So I've heard lots of enthusiastic Bogota dwellers who go on about this magic mayor. Their memories, however, of the second year of his term of office have virtually evaporated. They tried to impeach him because they thought the mayor had gone completely crazy. And that's an important point. Where's the mayor? There he is. That's an important point. Be patient with your visionary mayors is the key message. And it takes a lot of courage for a mayor to do this. So the point I'm making here is political decision-making can be key. This cost the city nothing. And it's saving money on wear and tear on the roads now because the private sector stepped in very happily to provide the buses that transport everybody in and out of the city. This is my favorite car. The reason this is my favorite car is that it's the first car that was designed. It's Gordon Murray, you may have heard of him, Formula One car designer. His first job was with Babraham, who's just died. Gordon Murray has gone over to the world of the circular economy. This car is designed to have no waste at all. It's made of plastic bottles, recovered plastic bottles. Because it's Gordon Murray, I'm afraid the top speed is about 130 miles an hour. And the driver sits in the middle with all of the Formula One knobs on the driving wheel, but it sells for £6,000 a pop. Right? And this is a city car that, with a petrol engine, does 100 miles to the gallon. It's made of plastic. Right? So the chassis is one piece of molded plastic. The average car has 1,500 metal bolts in the chassis. This has none. The chassis is produced online in 50 seconds. From plastic bottles to driving the car off is 5.5 minutes. Right, so you're looking at a totally new manufacturing process. And I believe this will eventually be the mode of the 21st century car manufacturing. We'll still need personal mobility as we go around, but we need to be thinking out of the box. And Gordon and I have been talking for years. We're both born in the same city in South Africa, Durban. And this was a dream we had, and now he's realized it. And it's all driven around this idea of the circular economy. There should be no waste. How do we design a car like that? We've got to harness the power of the sun on a large scale, but we also have to do it on a small scale, micro-generation. And yes, it's right, the price of photovoltaics has come down dramatically. It's only 80%, it's come down 80%. It's only 1/5 of the cost of where it was 8 years ago to install photovoltaics. For most parts of the world, at least those that are regularly sunny, this is now the cheapest way to produce electricity. Right? So as we move into those urban environments that are going to develop in much of the Asia-Pacific region and in Africa where there's plenty of sunshine, microgeneration of electricity becomes a key part of progress. I talked in Manila recently. This is a Manila waste tower with people living off the waste, but not many demands for the plastic. So what is left as the tower grows is plastic. Finally, in the Philippines, just over the past year, they've joined Kigali and Rwanda in banning plastic bags. So we're seeing the developing world showing us the way in terms of avoidance of waste that has little usage. So the circular economy is the notion that is now getting the rounds. I'll quickly come to a conclusion. The catapults were set up by government. This was the original brainchild of the previous government, but it has been totally enacted by the present government. And so we have 8 catapults at the moment. And the notion of each catapult is, first of all, It's a company, but a not-for-profit company that Peter and I have started up, the Future Cities Catapult. There are 8 of them focused on different areas where we close the gap between ideas, such as the circular economy, and taking the concept into the marketplace, commercializing it. Future Cities Catapult, let me just say a few words about that. It's about city integration. It's about bringing together in a holistic atmosphere in one building. We're going to be moving into a big building in Clerkenwell, and there we want to talk to mayors, we want to talk to politicians, we want to talk to the people who design cities, transport experts, all aspects of urban development, one space. And in this space, we'll take best practice from Bogota, best practice from Singapore. They've got one example of best practice that we can learn from: water management in Singapore. Every drop of water that falls on that city is captured, cycled, and recycled. And that includes sewage water. They recycle all the water for consumption. Our capabilities: Urban Innovation Center, Cities Lab, and a world-class team. And the team at the moment, in addition to Peter, there are 5 senior executives. We have about 40 staff, and it'll grow to about 70, I think, by the end of this year. So the idea is improve economy, quality of life, and reduce risk management going forward in time. City finance is going to be a crucial part of it. London, as I traveled around the world talking to city leaders, they all said London's the best place. The universities in London provide a good academic base, but the City of London becomes a crucial part of finding the finance for carrying this through. The Department for International Development is now partnering with us on this. They are very keen to see that the new urban environment in the developing world is developed rapidly. So I just go on to, this is our challenge: creating a global hub, a laboratory, a large computer capability, assembling all of the relevant players, creating future-proofed cities focused on the well-being of the citizens, contributing to the challenge of poverty eradication, and see if we can create new financial mechanisms to allow this to happen. So I leave you with our email address, and thank you for being so attentive.
Thank you, Sir David, for that very stimulating talk. We've got time for a few questions.
Many scholars suggest that the key challenge for the future of cities is growing inequality and the tensions that will arise and are arising, and that should be the key challenge. So I'd invite you to say perhaps a few more words about that, because that, I think, is more important than any of the other major issues you've mentioned.
Yes, I do agree with you, and if you read the abstract of my talk, I was planning to say much more about this. I was getting 5-minute signals. So, interestingly, if you look at studies of slums in cities, and there have been some very good studies, particularly of Indian cities, you will probably know that those studies show that these slums create their own economic environment with people who actually generate wealth within the slums themselves. Very often, as with the favela of South America, these slums are outside the normal activity of the rest of the city. So recently I had a long discussion with the mayor of Rio, who's very keen to come on board with us. And he's talking about pacifying the favela. Now, that's a pretty ugly word, but basically it's estimated that in Brazil 20% of electricity is effectively stolen by the occupiers of the favela. Now, that doesn't deal with poverty, and nor does it create good behavior, because that means that people leave their televisions on all the time, they have air conditioning with the doors open, it creates all sorts of bad effects. Poverty eradication is a matter, I believe, and this is what is happening in Rwanda, of very careful planning. I'm going to say that in effect there are no slums in Rwanda, but this doesn't just happen. It means that as the agricultural productivity of the country keeps improving, and it's a remarkable switchover from subsistence farming to cooperative farming that is dealing with that, as production goes up, families can no longer live off the land, they don't need to, and so they are moving into the city. By careful design, that can become a second engine of economic growth. Right? So creating jobs for these people so that there is a magnet in the city to bring them in. But it also means education, absolutely key to the process. And Rwanda, 20 years ago, just before the genocide, had no compulsory school education. Now they've got 10 years compulsory and free school education. Universities, the University of Rwanda had 2,500 students 20 years ago, now has 67,000. So there's a real sense in which education is driving this through. So as they come into the city, for example, the world's biggest vitamin manufacturer produces 93%, is DSM. They're now building a $30 million factory just outside Kigali, because they're confident they will get educated people who will provide the employment. This is all correlated with urban development. The urban sprawl that began with Kigali's development has now been halted because it's understood eventually the country of Rwanda, is quite small, would just be a city. And they can't afford, obviously, to do that. So I do think absolutely key to poverty eradication is the urban environment. In most parts of Africa and India, the majority of people have no access to electricity. And quite clearly, for any improvement in poverty eradication, that becomes a key part of going forward. And the rollout to all the villages of Africa and India of energy by extending electricity grids is never going to happen. That would be extraordinarily expensive. But with photovoltaics, microgrids, you can create mini urban environments. People, crucially for their business, agribusiness, can recharge mobile phones. And what you see is a potential for big change. But I'm just going to say, Rwanda is my classic example because of good governance in that country.
Thank you. In your graph of fuel use for transport against cities, did you take into account the commuting into London, where it drags in people from all around the southeast, and how are you going to be able to reduce this in future cities?
We didn't in that graph. That graph was simply taking the occupants of the city and not this. I live in Cambridge and my work is in the Foreign Office, so I'm one of those people who comes into the city. We didn't take that into account. But in a sense, what this is about in Britain is, first of all, the electrification of the grid, of the railway system. Still 40% of our railway system is burning diesel, which is incredibly silly. I've got to be so careful. I work for the government now, so I didn't really mean that. It's very expensive to burn diesel to run trains. But of course, it's the capital cost of continuing the electrification of the railway lines is high. That has to be a priority. So as we defossilize the electricity grid, the railway system becomes key. And then these people who are commuting in by train, who are now the majority, are a big wave of people going in the direction that we want to go in the future. Those people driving cars into the city are very rapidly disappearing. They may be parking in the outskirts, but the congestion charges are driving them out of the city centre.
One last question. I think there was a lady over there who had a hand up.
Thank you. I don't have any kids. I don't eat beef. I have photovoltaic panels on my roof. I can't fly. I don't drive. I upcycle. I contribute to the cultural capital through voluntary work. I work in community rejuvenation. I grow my own spinach. And I am a fairly typical resident of Greenbank. What more can we do?
I mean, what is interesting about what you're saying is that it again raises a topic I haven't raised before, which is human behavior underlies the whole thing. Last week I was in Seoul, and I was taken to meet a woman who is, you would love to meet her, and you would be on the same page completely. She's transforming a whole section of the city. And the way she's doing it is the children go to buy ice creams or whatever, but they're not allowed to go away with the ice cream or the candy floss until they've got on a bicycle and generated enough electricity to keep the operation going. Right? They still have to pay, but they are generating the electricity through their own activity. So it's in part an educational exercise. The big library in the center of this region of Seoul, she's taken over as her center of operation, all with the help of the mayor. And what she is doing in that library is creating this big educational atmosphere. And it's just spreading across this part of the city, with the shops visibly big advertisements selling low-carbon goods. So I think the ability of individuals to transform human behavior is absolutely critical. I think that I'm going to have to admit that your carbon footprint is exemplary. Mine is not. As a climate change negotiator, I have now been to 21 countries in the last 8 months. So we need more of you and less of me, I think.
Okay, well, we've reached our allotted time, so I'd just like to make a final comment. What Sir David has outlined there is an idea that the universities in Bristol are thinking about how we can underpin Green Capital Year, and the emerging theme that we've got is helping people learn how to behave sustainably. That's the key concept that's coming through. And we're starting to think through how we can support the city as a learning laboratory so that citizens of Bristol can learn how to live sustainably and share that learning around the world. So this is a very nice nexus of thinking here. So Sir David, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk tonight. I'm sure there will be many more questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. So if we can thank Sir David in the normal way.